The morning sun was shining bright over London as David stepped out of his hotel. He had been training in martial arts for 15 long years. Every day, every week, every month, he never missed practice. His hands were tough like rocks and his moves were faster than lightning. David owned 2 fighting schools back home. Students came from all over the city to learn from him. They called him the unbeaten champion because he had never lost a single fight. Not even once. His trophy room was full of gold medals and shiny cups. Whenever someone challenged him, the result was always the same. They ended up on the ground, and David stood tall as the winner. But success had changed David. He started thinking he was better than everyone else. He would look at other fighters and shake his head. "These people don't know real fighting," he would tell his students. "They're just playing around. I'm the only one who knows the true art of combat." His friends had noticed this change too. "David, you're becoming too proud," his old trainer had warned him once. "Pride comes before a fall." But David just laughed it off. He thought his teacher was jealous of his success. This trip to London was supposed to be special. David was here for a big martial arts show where fighters from around the world would demonstrate their skills. He had been invited as one of the main guests. The organizers had heard about his perfect record and wanted him to show his techniques to everyone. On his second day in London, David decided to take a break from the martial arts event. He wanted to see the famous places he had heard about. His first stop was Buckingham Palace. He had seen it in movies and pictures, but seeing it in real life was different. The palace was huge and beautiful. There were lots of tourists taking pictures and guides telling stories about the royal family. David joined a tour group and walked around the palace grounds. Everything was so clean and organized. The gardens were perfect, and the building looked like something from a fairy tale. But what caught David's attention wasn't the beautiful architecture or the rich history. It was the guards standing outside the palace. They wore red uniforms and tall black hats. They stood perfectly still, not moving even when tourists took pictures right next to them. David stopped walking and stared at these guards. Other tourists were amazed by how still they could stand. "Wow, look at that discipline," said an old man in the tour group. "They must train really hard to stand so still." But David saw something different. He didn't see discipline or training. He saw what he thought were just regular soldiers playing dress-up. "This is just for show," he whispered to himself. "These guys are not real fighters. They're just here to look pretty for the tourists." He started watching their stance more carefully. The way they held their weapons, how they positioned their feet, the way they kept their shoulders straight. To David, it all looked fake, like actors in a play pretending to be tough. Any real fighter could easily handle these guys, he thought, to himself. They probably don't even know how to throw a proper punch. They're just here to take pictures with tourists. David had fought against military people before. Some soldiers had come to his school wanting to learn martial arts. He had beaten them all easily. They were strong, yes, but they didn't have the technical skills that David had spent years perfecting. They relied on basic training and brute force. David relied on science, technique, and years of dedicated practice. As the tour group moved forward, David stayed behind for a few more minutes. He kept studying the guards, making mental notes about their weaknesses. "Their stance is too rigid," he observed. "They can't move quickly from that position, and they're holding those heavy weapons. That would slow them down even more." Chill. More he watched, the more confident he became. These weren't real warriors. They were just part of the tourist attraction. Like the toy soldiers he used to play with as a child, but bigger and dressed in fancy uniforms. David remembered a conversation he had with his students just last week. The problem with military training, he had told them, is that it teaches you to follow orders, not to think. Real fighting requires creativity and adaptation. You need to read your opponent and adjust your strategy instantly. Looking at these guards, David saw exactly what he was talking about. They looked like robots, stiff, predictable, and programmed to do only one thing: stand still and look impressive. But in a real fight, David was sure they wouldn't last 10 seconds against someone with his skills. He thought about all the different fighting styles he had mastered. Karate had taught him powerful strikes and solid stances. Judo had given him throwing techniques and ground control. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu had shown him how to submit opponents with joint locks and chokes. Boxing had improved his hand speed and footwork. These guards probably knew some basic military combat training. Maybe they could march in formation and follow commands. But real fighting, the kind that David practiced every day, he doubted they had ever experienced anything like that. As he finally walked away to catch up with his tour group, David couldn't stop thinking about those guards. Part of him wanted to show everyone what real fighting looked like. He imagined himself demonstrating his skills, showing the crowd how easily he could handle these toy soldiers. Maybe I should give them a little lesson, he thought with a smile. Show these tourists what a real martial artist can do. The seed of an idea was planted in David's mind, an idea that would soon grow into the biggest mistake of his life. But at that moment, walking through the beautiful palace grounds, David felt nothing but confidence and superiority. He had no idea that his perfect record was about to come to a very sudden and very painful end. The next morning, David couldn't get those guards out of his head. He had spent the whole night thinking about them. During breakfast at his hotel, he kept imagining how easily he could show everyone what real fighting looked like. I should go back there, he told himself while drinking his coffee, just to take another look. David wasn't supposed to visit the palace again. He had martial arts training scheduled for the afternoon and meetings with other fighters from around the world, but something was pulling him back to those guards. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was his ego, or maybe it was just destiny calling. He took the subway back to Buckingham Palace. The morning crowd was smaller than the day before. Mostly local, people walking to work and a few early tourists. David walked straight to where he had seen the guards yesterday. And there he was. The same guard in the same position. Red uniform, tall black hat, standing perfectly still like a statue. His name tag said J. Morrison, but David didn't really care about names. To him, this was just another person who needed to learn what real fighting was all about. David stood about 10 feet away from the guard and started watching him closely. The guard's eyes were looking straight ahead, not moving at all. His face showed no expression. His hands were positioned exactly the same way they had been yesterday. This guy's like a robot, David thought. Probably been standing here for hours without moving. What kind of training is that? In real fighting, you need to be flexible and ready to move instantly. A few tourists walked by and took pictures. The guard didn't react at all, not even when a little kid waved right in front of his face. This made David even more convinced that these guards were just for show. David moved a bit closer. Now he was about 6 feet away from the guard. He started making small comments, just loud enough for the guard to hear. Must be nice having such an easy job, David said with a smirk. Just stand there and look pretty. No real work required. The guard didn't move, not even a tiny muscle twitch. This made David bolder. I bet you've never been in a real fight in your life, David continued. All that fancy uniform probably makes you think you're tough, but you're just playing dress-up. Still no reaction. David was starting to get annoyed. He was used to getting responses when he talked to people. His students always listened carefully when he spoke. Other fighters respected his opinions, but this guard was treating him like he didn't even exist. More tourists started gathering around. They could sense something was happening even though they couldn't hear exactly what David was saying. Some of them started taking pictures, thinking this might be some kind of show. David noticed the growing crowd and felt energized. This was his chance to demonstrate his superiority in front of an audience. Back home, he always performed better when people were watching. The attention made him feel more confident and powerful. You know what I think? David said louder now, making sure the tourist could hear him. I think all you military guys are the same. You look tough in your uniforms, but when it comes to real fighting, you're just beginners. The guard's expression remained completely unchanged. His breathing was steady and calm. His posture was perfect. It was like David wasn't even there. This lack of reaction was driving David crazy. He was used to intimidating people. When he walked into a room, Other fighters would stop talking and pay attention. When he challenged someone, they would either back down or show some kind of nervous response. But this guard was different. He seemed completely unaffected by David's words. It was like trying to provoke a stone wall. "I've fought against military people before," David announced to the growing crowd of tourists. "They always think their basic training makes them fighters. But real martial arts, that takes years to learn, too. These guys spend most of their time marching and following orders." Some tourists started whispering among themselves. They weren't sure if this was part of some official demonstration or if this man was just causing trouble. But they kept watching, because it was more interesting than just taking regular tourist photos. David was getting more and more frustrated. He had expected some kind of reaction by now, at least a warning to move away or stop talking. But the guard remained as still as a statue. "I bet this guy couldn't last 10 seconds in a real fight," David said, his voice getting louder and more aggressive. "All that standing around has probably made his muscles stiff. He'd move like an old man if he actually had to defend himself." The crowd was getting bigger. Some people were recording with their phones now. David loved having an audience, and this was encouraging him to keep going. "You want to know the truth?" David addressed the crowd directly now. "These guards are just here for decoration. They're like those toy soldiers you see in shop windows. They look impressive, but they can't actually do anything useful." A few people in the crowd looked uncomfortable. They could sense that David was being disrespectful, but they weren't sure what to do about it. This wasn't their country and they didn't know what was appropriate. But David was just getting started. His ego was fully in control now, and he was enjoying the attention too much to stop. "I'll tell you what," David announced loudly, looking directly at the guard and then at the crowd. "I challenge this so-called guard to show everyone what he's made of. Let's see if all that fancy training is worth anything against someone who knows real fighting." The words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. David had just publicly challenged a royal guard in front of dozens of witnesses. The crowd went silent, sensing that something serious was about to happen. For the first time since David had started talking, the guard's eyes moved slightly. Just a tiny shift, barely noticeable, but David caught it and felt a rush of excitement. "Finally," he thought. "Now we're getting somewhere." What David didn't know was that the guard had been listening to every word he said, and what David also didn't know was that this particular guard had been waiting his entire military career for someone exactly like David to come along. The challenge had been made, and now, things were about to get very interesting. What happened next surprised everyone, including David. Instead of ignoring the challenge like before, the guard did something unexpected. He moved. It was just a small movement. The guard turned his head slightly and made eye contact with another guard who was standing nearby. Then he made a tiny hand signal that most people wouldn't even notice. But David saw it, and he felt his heart start beating faster with excitement. "He's actually going to do it," David thought. "He's going to accept my challenge." Within minutes, 3 men in dark suits appeared. They looked like security officers or maybe police detectives. One of them approached David while the other 2 started talking quietly with the guard. "Sir, I need you to come with me," the security officer said politely but firmly. David's first thought was that he was in trouble. Maybe challenging a royal guard was illegal. Maybe he was going to be arrested and thrown in jail. His martial arts demonstration later that day would be ruined. His reputation would be destroyed. But then something surprising happened. The security officer explained that the guard had actually requested permission to accept the challenge. However, it couldn't happen in public like this with all these tourists around. If David was serious about his challenge, they would need to move to a private area where it could be handled properly. David couldn't believe what he was hearing. Not only was the guard accepting his challenge, but the British authorities were actually going to allow it to happen. This was better than he had hoped for. "Of course I'm serious," David said confidently. "I've been waiting for this opportunity." The security officers led David and the guard through several corridors inside the palace complex. The tourists weren't allowed to follow, but David could hear them talking excitedly about what they had just witnessed. Some of them were probably posting about it on social media already. They arrived at a small courtyard area that was completely private. It was surrounded by high walls and had cameras positioned at different angles. Clearly, this was a place where the authorities could monitor everything that happened. "This will be conducted as a controlled demonstration," one of the security officers explained to David. "No weapons, no dirty tactics, and it stops immediately when one person can't continue. Are you absolutely sure you want to proceed?" David looked around the courtyard. It was perfect. Nice flat ground, plenty of space to move around, and good lighting. He had fought in much worse conditions before. "I'm ready," David announced confidently. For the first time, David got a good look at his opponent without the ceremonial uniform. The guard had changed into simple workout clothes, just a plain t-shirt and pants, without the fancy red jacket and tall hat. He looked more like a regular person. But there was something about the way he carried himself that was different from what David had expected. The guard moved with a quiet confidence that reminded David of some of the more experienced fighters he had met over the years. Still, David was sure his technical skills would be superior. David started his warm-up routine. He had developed this routine over many years, and it always helped him prepare mentally and physically for a fight. He stretched his legs, rotated his arms, and practiced some of his favorite combinations in the air. The warm-up was also psychological warfare. David wanted his opponent to see the speed and precision of his movements. He wanted to plant doubt in the guard's mind before the fight even started. As David went through his routine, he noticed that a few more people had appeared in the courtyard. They were clearly officials or security personnel, but they stayed at a distance and watched quietly. David assumed they were there to make sure everything stayed fair and safe. The guard, meanwhile, was doing something completely different. He wasn't stretching or practicing moves or showing off his skills. He was just standing calmly, breathing slowly, and watching David's warm-up routine with mild interest. This strange behavior made David even more confident. "This guy doesn't even know how to prepare for a fight," he thought. "He's probably never faced anyone with real training before." David finished his warm-up and felt great. His muscles were loose, his reflexes were sharp, and his mind was focused. He had visualized this moment during his warm-up, and he could already see himself winning, easily. "I'll start with some basic combinations to test his defenses," David planned. "Once I see how slow he is, I'll move in for a quick takedown. This whole thing will probably be over in less than a minute." The security officer stepped forward to give final instructions. "Gentlemen, this is a demonstration of skills, not a street fight. The objective is to show your abilities, not to seriously injure each other. When I say stop, you stop immediately. Are we clear?" Both men nodded. David positioned himself in his favorite fighting stance. It was a modified karate position that allowed him to attack quickly with either his hands or his feet. He had used this same stance to defeat hundreds of opponents over the years. The guard stood in a much more relaxed position. His hands were loose at his sides, his feet were about shoulder-width apart, and his weight seemed evenly distributed. To David, it looked like the guard wasn't even ready to fight. "This is going to be easier than I thought," David said to himself. The security officer looked at both men one final time. "Ready?" he asked. David nodded eagerly. He had been ready for this moment since yesterday when he first saw this guard. Finally, he would get to show everyone what real martial arts looked like. The guard nodded once very slightly. His expression remained calm and focused. "Begin," the security officer announced. David immediately launched into action, just as he had planned. He threw a fast combination of punches aimed at testing the guard's reactions and defenses. These weren't his strongest attacks. They were designed to gather information about his opponent's speed and skill level. But something went wrong. Very wrong. Instead of the slow, predictable response David was expecting, the guard moved like lightning. In one smooth motion that seemed to happen in slow motion, the guard stepped to the side, caught David's extended arm, and delivered a single strike to David's chest. David felt the impact like a lightning bolt. His vision went blurry instantly. His legs stopped working. His brain seemed to disconnect from his body. And then everything went black. The last thing David remembered was the strange feeling of falling, as if the ground was rushing up to meet him. But by the time his body hit the courtyard floor, David was already unconscious and completely unaware of what had just happened to him. The entire exchange had lasted less than 3 seconds. The silence in the courtyard was deafening. Everyone who had been watching stood frozen, trying to process what they had just witnessed. David lay motionless on the ground, his body completely limp and his eyes closed. The security officers immediately sprang into action. One of them knelt down next to David and checked his pulse and breathing. Another one spoke quickly into his radio, calling for medical assistance. The third officer was already clearing the area and making sure everything was being recorded properly. "He's breathing normally," the officer next to David reported. "Pulse is strong, looks like he just got knocked unconscious." The guard, meanwhile, had already stepped back to a respectful distance. He stood calmly with his hands behind his back, showing no emotion at all. It was as if nothing unusual had happened. To him, this was probably just another day at work. But, for everyone else in that courtyard, what they had just seen was absolutely shocking. David had been moving fast and aggressively, throwing punches with obvious skill and experience. He looked like he knew exactly what he was doing. And then, in the blink of an eye, it was over. The guard had moved so smoothly and efficiently that some of the witnesses weren't even sure what had actually happened. They had seen David attack, they had seen the guard respond, and then suddenly, David was on the ground. Did anyone see exactly what he did? One of the security officers asked quietly. "It looked like he just stepped to the side and pushed him." Another officer replied, equally confused. But it wasn't a push. What the guard had done was far more sophisticated than that. While David was focused on throwing his combination of punches, the guard had read his movement pattern instantly. He had seen the opening that David's aggressive attack had created, and he had exploited it with surgical precision. The strike that knocked David unconscious had been delivered to a very specific spot on his chest, a pressure point that, when hit with the right amount of force and the correct angle, could temporarily disrupt the nervous system. It wasn't dangerous or permanently harmful, but it was incredibly effective. This was not something they taught in regular martial arts schools. This was military combat training at its highest level, the kind of technique that soldiers learned when their lives depended on ending fights as quickly as possible. Medical personnel arrived within 3 minutes. They were palace medical staff, who were trained to handle emergencies quickly and discreetly. They immediately began checking David's vital signs and assessing his condition. "Everything looks normal," the lead medic reported after his initial examination. "No signs of serious injury. His body just needs time to recover from the shock. He should wake up soon." While the medical team worked, one of the security officers approached the guard to get his report on what had happened. "Standard defensive response," the guard explained simply. "He attacked, I neutralized the threat, no excessive force was used." The security officer nodded and made notes in his report. This kind of incident was rare, but it wasn't completely unusual. Occasionally, tourists or visitors would challenge guards or try to test their reactions. Most of the time, these situations could be handled with words or by simply removing the troublemaker. But when someone actually threw punches, as David had done, the guards were authorized to defend themselves appropriately, and this guard had done exactly what he was trained to do: end the confrontation as quickly and safely as possible. About 15 minutes after hitting the ground, David started to stir. First, his eyes fluttered open, looking confused and unfocused. Then he tried to sit up, but the medics gently held him down. "Take it easy," the lead medic said. "You've been unconscious. We need to check you over before you try to move." David's first sensation was confusion. He couldn't remember where he was or what had happened. The last thing he could recall clearly was starting his warm-up routine and feeling confident about the upcoming demonstration. What happened?" David asked weakly. His voice sounded strange to him, like it was coming from far away. "You were in a demonstration with one of our guards," the security officer explained carefully. "You got knocked out. The medical team says you're going to be fine, but you need to rest for a few minutes." David tried to piece together what the officer was telling him. A demonstration? Knocked out? That didn't make sense. David had never been knocked out in his life. He had never even been seriously hurt in any of his fights. Slowly, fragments of memory started coming back. He remembered challenging the guard. He remembered the courtyard. He remembered feeling confident and ready to show off his skills. But he couldn't remember the actual fight at all. There was just a blank space where those few seconds should have been. One moment he was preparing to demonstrate his superior martial arts abilities, and the next moment he was waking up on the ground with medical personnel standing over him. "How long was I out?" David asked, still trying to understand what had happened. "About 15 minutes, the medic replied while checking David's eyes with a small flashlight. David felt a wave of humiliation wash over him. 15 minutes? He had been unconscious for 15 minutes? That meant whatever had happened to him had been serious. People don't stay unconscious for 15 minutes just because they slipped and fell. Did he actually knock me out?" David asked, though he already knew the answer. The security officer nodded. "It was over very quickly. You threw some punches, he defended himself, and you went down immediately." David closed his eyes and tried to remember something, anything, about the actual confrontation. But there was nothing there. His mind was completely blank about those crucial few seconds. As the medical team continued their examination, David had time to think about what this meant. His perfect record was over. His reputation as an unbeatable fighter was destroyed. Worse than that, he had been defeated so completely that he couldn't even remember how it happened. Back home, David was known for analyzing every fight in detail. He would break down his opponent's techniques, explain their mistakes, and teach his students about strategy and tactics. But this fight? He had nothing to analyze because he couldn't remember any of it. The guard, who had been standing quietly throughout David's recovery, finally approached when the medical team was finishing their work. "Are you feeling better?" the guard asked politely. David looked up at him, this man who had just shattered his entire worldview in less than 3 seconds. The guard looked completely normal. No signs of fatigue, no indication that he had just been in a fight. He could have been asking about the weather. "Yeah, I think so," David replied, though he wasn't really sure about anything anymore. "Good," the guard said simply. "I hope you learned something today." And with that, the guard walked away, returning to his duties as if nothing had happened. David was left sitting there, surrounded by medics and security officers, trying to process the most humbling experience of his entire life. The medical team cleared David to leave after another 30 minutes of observation. Physically, he was perfectly fine. The guard had used just enough force to knock him unconscious without causing any lasting damage. But mentally and emotionally, David was in pieces. As he walked out of the palace complex, David felt like he was in a dream. Everything around him seemed unreal. The tourists, the beautiful buildings, the busy London streets. It all felt like he was watching someone else's life through a television screen. The security officers had been very professional about the whole incident. They explained that what had happened would be documented in their reports, but it wouldn't become public information unless David chose to make it public himself. The palace guards dealt with these situations regularly and had procedures in place to handle them discreetly. "We understand this must be embarrassing for you," one of the officers had said kindly. "But we hope you can learn from this experience." David took a taxi back to his hotel, staring out the window at the London scenery he had been so excited to see just a few hours earlier. Now, everything looked different. The city seemed bigger and more intimidating. He felt small and lost. Back in his hotel room, David sat on the edge of his bed and tried to make sense of what had happened. He pulled out his phone and looked at his social media accounts. There were several messages from people back home asking how his trip was going and wishing him luck with his martial arts demonstration. The demonstration. David had completely forgotten about it. He was supposed to be showing his techniques to other martial artists in just a few hours. How could he face them now? How could he teach anyone anything when he had just been knocked out by someone in 3 seconds? David canceled his appearance at the martial arts event. He told the organizers that he wasn't feeling well and couldn't participate. It was the first time in his career that he had backed out of a commitment. That night, David couldn't sleep. He kept replaying the few memories he had of the incident. He remembered feeling confident. He remembered his warm-up routine. He remembered thinking that the guard would be easy to defeat. And then nothing, just a blank space where his defeat lived. The next morning, David decided to do something he had never done before. He went online and started researching Royal Guards. What he found shocked him more than the knockout itself. The guard who had defeated him wasn't just a ceremonial soldier. Royal Guards were selected from elite military units. Many of them had served in special forces. They received extensive combat training that went far beyond basic military instruction. The guard he had challenged, David learned, was probably a veteran of real combat situations. While David had been practicing martial arts in comfortable gyms with willing students, this man had been using his skills in life-or-death situations around the world. David spent hours reading about military combat training. He learned about techniques he had never heard of, methods of fighting that were designed not for sport or demonstration, but for survival. Ways of ending fights quickly and efficiently when every second could mean the difference between life and death. For the first time in his martial arts career, David realized how much he didn't know. When David returned home a week later, his students immediately noticed that something was different about him. He was quieter, more thoughtful. He didn't boast about his achievements or criticize other fighters like he used to. "How was London, Sensei?" one of his students asked. "Did you show them how it's done?" David was quiet for a long moment. "I learned something important in London," he finally said. "I learned that there's always more to learn." Over the following months, David completely changed his approach to martial arts and teaching. Instead of focusing on winning and proving his superiority, he started emphasizing humility, respect, and continuous improvement. He began studying different types of combat and self-defense, including military techniques and real-world applications. He realized that his tournament fighting experience, while valuable, was just one small part of a much larger world of combat arts. Most importantly, David started teaching his students about the dangers of overconfidence. He would tell them stories about fighters who thought they knew everything, only to discover how much they still had to learn. "The moment you think you're unbeatable," David would tell his classes, "is the moment you stop growing as a martial artist." David never told his students exactly what had happened in London. The details were too embarrassing and he didn't want to relive the humiliation. But he did share the lesson he had learned. "I once met someone who taught me more in 3 seconds than I had learned in years of training," he would say. "He taught me that real strength comes from understanding your limitations, not from pretending you don't have any." Some of David's old students noticed the change and didn't like it. They had come to his school because of his reputation as an unbeatable champion. When he started talking about humility and continuous learning, they went looking for other instructors who would feed their egos instead. But David didn't mind losing those students. The ones who stayed were more serious about their training and more open to learning. The atmosphere in his schools became more supportive and less competitive. Students helped each other improve instead of trying to prove who was the best. David also started training with other instructors regularly. He would visit schools that taught different martial arts styles, always presenting himself as a student rather than an expert. He learned techniques from boxing coaches, wrestling instructors, and even military combat veterans. Each new experience taught him something valuable. Every instructor he trained with had knowledge and skills that David had been missing. His fighting abilities actually improved dramatically once he stopped thinking he already knew everything. A year after the incident in London, one of David's longtime students asked him directly about the change in his teaching style. "Sensei, you used to talk about being unbeatable all the time," the student said. "Now you talk about learning from everyone. What changed?" David smiled and looked out the window of his training facility. "I met someone who reminded me what martial arts is really about," he said. "It's not about proving you're better than everyone else. It's about becoming the best version of yourself." The student nodded, but David could see he didn't fully understand yet. That was okay. Understanding would come with time and experience, just like it had for David. Sometimes, late at night when David was alone in his training facility, he would think about that guard in London. He wondered if the man even remembered their brief encounter. Probably not. For the guard, It had probably been just another minor incident in a long career of service. But for David, those 3 seconds had changed everything. They had destroyed his arrogance and rebuilt his character. They had ended one chapter of his life and started a much better one. David never went back to London, but he often thought about making the trip. Not to challenge anyone or prove anything, but simply to say thank you to the man who had given him the most valuable lesson of his life. The lesson that true strength comes from knowing how much you still have to learn.